Welcome, everyone. What a night. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Scott Korb. I'm the director of the Pacific University MFA in Writing program with offices here in Portland, Oregon, land of the Chinookan tribes who live near the intersection of the Willamette and Columbia Rivers. Today, their descendants are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Yakama Nation, and other tribal nations. And I am thrilled to be joined in Portland tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't meet all in person out on the Forest Grove campus today. I'm thrilled to be joined this evening by the writer Kesha Ajose Fisher, who will be reading from and discussing with me and you her story collection, No God Like the Mother, which I have right here on my bookshelf, and I'll probably be turning to it shortly. Hello, Kesha. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Scott, for having me.
The event tonight is presented for Black History Month, and the MFA in Writing was joined in partnership tonight by the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Pacific, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Student Counseling Center, and the Student Multicultural Center. And before getting started with an introduction of Kesha, I would like to thank Jean Garcia Chitwood from the Student Multicultural Center, and Narcé Rodriguez and Jennifer Teeter from the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for all their work in support of this, and also for their friendship, and Kesha for being here most of all. So I'm going to get started with, please, yeah, Kesha is here, a word or two, and then I'll get started with an introduction.
No, it's great. Thank you, Scott. And thanks to everyone who've chosen to share your evening with us today. I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm excited to share my evening with you.
Yeah. So Kesha's first book, No God Like the Mother, won the Ken Kesey Award for Fiction in the 2020 Oregon Book Awards. This will be the work we will talk most about over the next hour or so, which is the time we'll be together. Kesha was also awarded the 2021 Oregon Literary Arts Writer of Color Fellowship, and will be hosting, so excited for this, the 2022 Oregon Book Awards for Literary Arts on April 25th. And I'll put a link in the chat for you to all see that. Check that out, especially if you're living in Portland. Kesha has also earned a number of other awards for her essays and stories that she's written over the years, including the Phoenix Literary Magazine Editor's Choice Award for Short Fiction in both 2011 and 2012. And her writing has been published in several online and print collections, and in such publications as Multicultural Familia Magazine, Alchemy Literary Magazine, and Beyond Black and White Magazine. Kesha was born in Chicago and raised in Lagos, Nigeria. She now lives in Portland with her family, and from what I've read and from what Kesha told me before we all got started, her dog, Oscar. So as I say, this event will last about an hour, and we may go a little long because I'd like to be sure we have plenty of time for questions from the audience. But I would like to begin with a reading from Kesha. And if you would start us off with something from the book and a little bit of context, then I will disappear and allow our audience to focus on you. So Kesha, take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. Again, thank you so much for sharing your evening with me this evening. I still can't believe sometimes my luck and the opportunities that I get to share really what is a compilation of the thoughts that pop into my head that I decided to put on paper and now get to share with the world. I wanted to read from one of the stories in No God Like the Mother. I should also say, first of all, that my baby girl created the artwork for this book. Dara, I love you so much. And the theme of No God Like the Mother is essentially around the relationships between mothers and their children and the traumas that mothers take into the work of rearing children. And when I first began writing, I don't know that I knew that that's where I was headed. I just wanted to share what it was like to be female in the world, not particularly with my own experiences. Some of these do have moments from my life, but from stories that I hear and have encountered in my work as a social worker, as a parent, as a friend to other women who have who are trying to make their way in the world in their existence as peacefully as possible. And conversations just always lead to stories, and most of these come from there. The story that I've chosen to share tonight is based on a moment in conversation that I had with my mother when I was about 8 or 9 years old. We were living in Nigeria at the time. I should say my mother is African American, dad is Nigerian, and we were being raised in Nigeria. And so something that happens in Nigeria and of course around Africa, and as we know now, it's happening here in the States, it happens in the UK. And we've since wrapped this, awful experience, we've wrapped it in, fine little letters. We call it FGM now, but it's essentially female genital mutilation. And I wanted to tell a story about how that thing that exists in the world came into my life. But I needed to share it from the point of view of a child, and the way that children tend to deal with their trauma by going into a dreamlike world or dreamlike state. And that's where it actually first began. But in that conversation that I had with my mother when I was younger, I'd encountered a friend at school who said she was so excited about having this procedure done. I can't quite remember what she called it, but I remember, the excitement in her eyes, and she'd gone off for the weekend, I believe, to go have this procedure done. And what happened was I never saw her again. And I remember asking my mom, I said, so-and-so went to go have this procedure done. She seemed so excited about it. Can I have one? Can I have several of them? I don't know why. It was, I didn't understand really the meaning, right, is what was happening there. And my mother, in that moment, I remember seeing her eyes, stiffen, and she turned quite angry, and she said, "You don't want that. It's something that shouldn't happen in the world." And I still didn't have the comfort in asking her exactly what was happening. Probably not until I was an adult did I gain the understanding of what this procedure was, why it happens to so many girls around the world. And sometimes when you are faced with a problem, I at least like to think that my next thought is always, how do I help change it? And in this case, it was to write about it. I know that's a long way to explain that I'm reading from this one short story, but that it really is where it came from. And in years later, working as a social worker for African immigrants and refugees, who then also shared with me that they'd had this procedure and they were concerned about their daughters having it. It really, came to the forefront of my mind that I needed to speak up for how it had affected my thoughts and my mind and my fears for other girls around the world who have to experience it. Okay, so I will move forward now. Thanks for your patience with me and my long-winded explanations. So the title of this story, From No God Like the Mother, is called The Bride Price. The Bride Price. The rains had come and gone, and the earth was sweaty beneath the scorching Sudanese sky. The women came out to the measured call of the first drum. One foot led the other in sync, equally decorated at the ankles with rings of shells and sharpened twigs. Bodies swayed gently, wrapped from top to floor in their colorful tube that flowed in the settling wind. Heads were adorned with crowns of braided hair, cowrie beads, and feathers from fertile birds. Feet quickened feverishly to the sounds of a pending celebration. One head was bare, smooth from the razor strip around her skull just moments before. They called her Ma'a, the word for water, for all the rain that accompanied her birth. Ma'a followed as the elders split a path to the center of the field, though she wished only to see more of the dancers. The darkness ahead hung high, pulling dread from its deepest lair. Ma'a's heart thrashed inside its cage like caught mackerel, yet she let her lips spill no distress. Grandmother spoke, "Come along, show your worth." The words slipped into and gonged around her head. Trusting the mouth of an elder whose worth was exhibited similarly long ago, Ma'a stepped forward. The formerly lonesome drum merged with the others to strike a beat that flowed into the heavens. When the sound returned to earth, it awakened a dance among the women, and their voices hummed in unison. Matriarch stood to sing, and the women's bodies shook as if fire took hold of their feet. Ma'a wanted to empty her mind of its fear. All she had ever seen lay between the points of the untamed Red Sea and the surreptitious gardens outside her village. Spread behind the horizon was a world far beyond her grasp. Ma'a hoped to see it one day. That, however, required traveling some unknown journey, one she could not fathom no matter how hard she squeezed the thoughts in. Before she allowed her mind to carry itself away, a pinch at her side pulled her from the distraction. She moved her feet. As if suddenly empowered by the unknown, she pictured all that was good: warmth from the night air, rain fresh from its seasonal break, and food for the way it made her feel complete. "Show your worth," she whispered to herself. "Go in there and lie down. It will soon be over." A pair of old freckled hands led her into the tent. Inside the cabin, of stretched goat hide and reinforced branches from Arabica trees, Ma'a spotted a bed of dried and woven banana leaves. She let her knees lead her to the floor before twirling onto her backside. As if descending upon her, eyes as hollow as the blackness of night blinked above her petrified body. Hidden behind the glare of mothers and daughters of great-grandmothers was blatant camaraderie and hopes of another smooth transition. The earth grew loose inside Ma'a's grip. Indeed, she spread her callow legs, and another duo of even more mature hands placed the sharpened metal between them before severing the evil that lured so many to sin. Ma'a screamed. Warmth began to travel down her split slowly. Thrashing about, she cursed them, those mothers and grandmothers, and she swore to the dirt as it drank from her blood. 4 pairs of hands pinned her limbs against the ground as the remaining flesh was sliced off in one brazen swipe. 2 more available palms cupped her mouth, trapping the cries of a child en route to womanhood. "Do not scream anymore. Your younger ones are listening," hissed a voice as coarse as the withered leaves beneath Ma's bleeding bottom. The severity of pain as that special skin split from her body was unexpected, even with all 9 years of preparation. She called upon death, saw it as the only gate from that hell. "Please, come for me," she cried again and again until her screams dwindled into soft whispers of defeat. As the oldest hands sealed the hole with what felt like thorns, Ma'a implored the universe for relief. The wound was then anointed with a mixture of oils and herbs. Chants sounded from all their throats, but the bitterness of Ma'a's lament overrode their song. With her eyes shut, she imagined herself gifted with the freedom of birds that glide in the sky when the sun is highest. And she said, "If only I were one of you." When night fell, the tears and pain did not retreat as her mother promised, and Ma'a felt cheated once more. By morning, the sky ripped the blackness off its chest and trees raised their heads to the sun. A rush of hot water filled the basin, and Ma'a reached in with a cloth. "Soon, a husband will come for you," said the timid voice inside her head, but she swatted at it as she had the flies that circled her meals. Days in, and the spikes inside her wound tempted her to scratch. Ma'a picked at the patch of leaves and cloth, hoping to find her missing flesh behind the folds. Each time she glanced between her legs, there was more blood. Lulled dormant by the sight of all that red, a dream invited her into its timeless wonder. She heard voices gurgling, and the jerking pull of her waist this way and that rocked her deeply. In her dream, she found herself in the secret garden, a meeting place for the souls of lost children. It is beautiful here, she said to the grand palms and endless array of fruit trees. Rooted in a line, they led her to the eternal quarters of children like her brother, who had never grown past his first breath. Children like her sister, who never returned after being cut, and all the other children whose bones were set in a maze of human ways. Clear water beneath the white-faced moon carried life up the stream, and Ma'a stepped into her namesake. The breath of the woods kissed her skin as she floated in the warmth of the night. She feasted on honey and berries and placed her body flat against the earth until droplets of rain landed on her one by one. Rain began falling upon the roof like soldiers marching, and waking from slumber was like traveling at unnatural speeds. Time blew in and out of view. Numbness bolted her hips to the floor, and she screamed to rid her body of the pain. To run through the silver lines that stitched earth to sky is all she wanted, but for the pain. When a hand on her head peeled wide her eyes and poured in a fiery light, the sounds around slipped away. Later, Ma emerged from darkness to the thuds of her head bobbing against a floating bed. Her eyes followed the moon and the stars that winked above the trees ahead. Unfamiliar language planted itself inside her ears, whispering, "You will be all right. You're going to a hospital." There, the screaming cut through her days like wind through trees. The scent of blood and fermented flesh unfurled in the air, and bodies of more moaning girls arrived on makeshift beds and shabby trucks. Ma'a felt the stubble on her head and reached between her legs. A pillow filled the void where the pain had subsided. She smiled, remembering the way those women danced, and sang to her as she entered the hut. At the end of 40 days, she would be seen as a woman back in her village. Boys would no longer be permitted to frolic in the fields of knee-high grass with her, and men would come for negotiations. Once chosen, her body would belong to her husband for as long as she lived, and her hole would be reopened for him and his babies when the time came. It was the price one paid to be wife and mother, she thought, a price that might be worth it one day. But until then, Ma'a chose to rest. In her dream, she danced like rain. She raced through the fields of bone and grass and rinsed her body in the warm night air. Sitting inside the arms of the river, she watched birds soaring back and forth as freely as the sky is wide.
Wow, thank you, Kesha, for that reading. And I mean, a moving reading, and it's clear to me that in reading it yourself, you find yourself moved by the themes continually. And I'll just pause for a moment to thank you for reading that and for being with us and to share your work. So many of the group who are here in attendance are writers like you. And I often find it's useful, and you've provided us a little bit of context of how you get from point A to point B as a writer, thinking about the story of hearing about this particular story coming from your mother, and you've talked about your life and social work. but I know from reading some of what you've said about this book that No God Like the Mother took about a decade to put together. That part of getting the book into the world and having your voice out there, as you're saying, sort of adding to this larger conversation, meant balancing a demanding life of work and family with a life of writing and a commitment to art. And I wonder if you can talk with us a little bit about, especially because so many in this group are writers themselves, and sort of think about that long process and the various paths that one can take from, through an MFA program, say, or through a life up to the publication of a book. So what was the path from having something to say, putting it together, and then finally having the book out there, as you're describing,
Um,
as it is, I should say.
sure. No, that's a great question. I have to say, yes, I love writing. I know that it's the one thing that moves me. I wake up every day excited for the moment I get to open my laptop and start, freeing all the thoughts that I have to keep in my head. But I also have, a quite serious life. I had 4 human beings to raise, at 5 if you include my husband, and the dogs and the house, and all of these things. And for most of that time, I worked full time as well. That's not easy. I don't know where I found the time to do any of those things, let alone add following my dream and sharing stories to the already full plate. But I think I always knew that I wanted to do this. I didn't know that it would be a short story collection. I had, quite a complex relationship with my mother, and in the attempt to try to sort out some of the meaning behind some of the treatment that I had from my mother and the other women who I ended up having to go live with, who helped raise me, I always wanted to tell their stories. So I knew that was a given. So with my busy life, I knew that if this thing was nagging at me and calling at me, I needed to find time for it. And when I had I have 4 children, I should say. And when we decided to have the third, I knew that, we couldn't afford daycare or anything like that with 3 children, as social workers ourselves. And hello to everyone. Social workers, $9 an hour. I mean, that wasn't, and living in Portland, and we decided to make another human being. And without being able to afford daycare, I had to turn my house into a daycare so that I could I could work at home, bring other children in and be there to support my family. And I remember now hearing some of these families have become friends, and we're all still connected. And one of the children who was in my daycare from when she was about 2 years old till she went to kindergarten, she's now 16, 17, and an amazing basketball player. She still says she remembers seeing me while they're supposed to be napping. She would see me with the laptop at the dining table. So really that's the long way of getting to the answer was I had to find the time. If it calls, if writing is something that you love, honestly, as much as I know I love it, I can't compare passions, but that feeling is what I chase, is that moment when, after I've taken my children to school and I come back and I walk the dogs, and I come back and I walk the second one because they can't be together because because they're, Oscar is not very nice. And then I get that moment where I get to sit in front of my laptop and I know that everyone's fine. Children are safe. The dogs are happy. The husband's, at work helping people, and I get to be here. That's what I look for. And if that feeling is there where, you're elated to be staring at a screen, I've had jobs where I had to stare at a computer screen, but I didn't have that feeling, but I'm creating these lives. That's where it came from, is really finding the time. Yes, I do get to use most of my days now to focus only on writing, but honestly, that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't dared to chase that dream of trusting in myself and following through with No God Like the Mother.
What about, there's a sort of practical path that says, when the kids are asleep, I have to open my laptop and start typing. But there's this other path, which I think there are writers who have practical solutions to writing about what you've described as brutally honest things.
Mhm.
But it seems to me that there's um, a different set of skills and a different set of I don't know, maybe coping mechanisms or whatever the word might be, to be able to take a path toward those difficult things in those stolen moments. So can you talk a little bit about what it's taken you to sort of cross from, okay, now I have time, but now I have to get into this really difficult material. So what's that about for you?
You know how some people will they'll create an outline for their storytelling. They need to have an idea or a picture in their mind of where the story is going. I don't have that skill. I pop it open and I sit down and I just start telling a story. And I really essentially have to walk through every moment to get it down, if that makes any sense, right? Even the story that I just shared with you, it was about, picturing these women dancing and the feelings that might come from it. I think I really do put myself into the moment so that I can feel the emotions that come from that, from the experience that I might be describing. And then knowing that regardless of where I might choose to steer my mind to, I have to be honest in that moment about how I would feel if I were an 8-year-old girl and these women are suddenly dancing and the drumming is, I'm surrounded by drumming and it's beautiful. That's what is almost honest to me. So that's what I will put down. Now for, writing the difficult scene in Thief, where I have to now describe the sexual assault, that's different. I have to go into a really dark place in my mind to decide, if I were this awful person, um, and really, I don't know, this, I know this sounds out there, but it's really about putting myself in their shoes and becoming that person to write it in a way that it would, feel most honest, right? You can fake almost anything with words. I could tell you anything today. I could tell you that I'm, the king of all the dogs on the planet, right? But I think you can fake anything with words, but there's no faking emotion when it demands honesty. And that's really what drives my writing is anything that I'm choosing to share in my storytelling, it has to be honest, regardless of how dark or I don't know, terrifying maybe, as well as how terrifying it might feel for me to go into that place.
And there's a moment in the story you just read, and I'll just read the moment again, where there's a real turn, right? Maha screamed, warmth began to travel down her split slowly, thrashing about, she cursed them, right?
Mm.
The moment moves from what's happening to her to this agency and this cursing, and that it just felt to me like a turn that comes in the moment of writing through that empathy, through that imagination that you're describing.
And it's exactly that, right? It's empathy. If you feel it because you can empathize for this child, right? It really is a baby lying there and having to experience something new about the world, surrounded by the women who were supposed to protect her, right? And maybe some of that comes from my background in that, I had a mother who was quite broken and she struggled with quite a few things with drugs and alcohol. And, when she was in prison, I had to go live with different family members and I had to, I was always really trying to maneuver or find a way to learn about the women who are now in charge of me. And it was, family member after family member, friends, on really any space, where any place where strangers made a space for me. And so taking from my experience where I'm feeling, exactly helpless and having zero control of my life, it's what I would have liked to do, but never quite did, right? I wish I could have, when I was being beaten by someone for, taking a piece of meat or drinking or not moving fast enough, whatever it had to have been, is finding in that moment how I would have liked to have responded, knowing that my safety relied on me not responding, and wanting to maybe showcase that here in a way that I wished I'd been brave enough to speak up when I didn't feel I was being loved, in a way that I really wished the little girl that I used to be had been loved. And I promise that's all the sad that I will share about my life.
Well, that leads me to two is, you know, we often get asked as writers, like, who's your audience? Who are you writing for? And sometimes when we answer the question, we describe an ideal reader out there who's there to read the book. But Kesha, you've just described an ideal reader who is yourself, maybe the younger you, and then a whole, group of young girls and women who follow you, who then can see into this book the very things that you are describing right now. That wish that you could have been that bit more courageous, right, in those moments.
Yeah.
For someone to read that, seems to me it could be very, really powerful, meaningful experience.
No, thank you for saying that. I hope so. That's the hope anyway, right? This is going to sound like I'm name dropping, but I was in a meeting with Kathy Park Hong just a few weeks ago, and we were, this fabulous conversation. Kathy had come to Portland to discuss her book, Minor Feelings, and I was my next project. I was sharing with Kathy that I'd written about family stuff. And my fear was that, yes, I had a chaotic childhood, and I'm an open book. I share about, there's nothing that I really feel like I can keep in anymore, because I was forced into so much silence as a child. I like to say, if they let me, share my feelings and my thoughts back then, I wouldn't be writing a book about all of it now. So, but then there's that guilt that comes with wanting to share about your family, the family secrets. And I remember Kathy saying, you're not writing it for anyone, do it for that little girl who couldn't speak up when you are in those circumstances that really, are affecting you today. Yes, I'm married to a wonderful man. I have these beautiful children who are, I know, going to change the world. I've got these amazing dogs that wake me every morning and tell me that they show me that I'm so loved. I can't complain about my life, but I know that there was a time where I did not have that freedom. And I wish that I don't know that I could have, curated that, the bravery that was required to, to withstand a lot of my experiences back then, but going into future projects and knowing the kind of stories that I plan to tell in the future, it really is about honesty and at every step along the way. It really has to be that it comes from the heart. And I don't know who I can say the audience is, because you never know, this tiny book is, no bigger than my finger. But somehow it's reaching people, and maybe, the audience somehow finds its way to it. I don't know that I can say specifically that I'm writing for anyone outside of girls who probably were raised like me, who didn't feel safe in their girlhood or their presence on this planet, and hoping that someone reads it one day and decides, no, I don't want to be beaten today. No, I don't want to be homeless. No, I don't want to, fear that the partner I've chosen to be with in life is going to abuse me, and knowing that they have the voice to escape their situations.
My next question is going to invoke one of those girls from your book. And, one of the ways in which we framed this event tonight echoed the way that the book itself has been framed, as revolving around the themes of the child, the mother, and the world. And what became plain to me in reading the book, and I'll say too, that I read this book as soon as it arrived in my life in the summer of 2020, when I hadn't been able to read at all.
Mhm.
I was in the midst of just trying to figure out what the world was going to look like, and then it arrived in my life, and that's when I first read it, and I've come back to reread it in preparation for tonight.
Yeah.
Um, but it seems to me that in reading the book, that those three ideas of the child, the mother, and the world are really inseparable. That they're not three distinct themes, but they always work together in this book, one playing on the other. And I'm going to read a little bit, if you don't mind, from the book, just a short paragraph of what I think is a good example from a story called Nobody's Child, where 17-year-old Josephine, she's living on her own in Oakland, faces motherhood alone. She's feeling rejected by her own judgmental mother, and her daughter Tia, newborn, is inconsolable. Right, that's the situation she's facing. So here's just a bit from this. She had heard this worked, ignoring to conquer. Baby accepted the challenge. Steadily, Tia's crying took shape, mounting from low to thunderous. The jutting of her legs was no longer due to pleasure. Sweat gathered on her scalp. Sweat gathered on both their faces, right? Mother and child, mirror images of one another, right? Josephine stared out the window at her as her daughter screamed and the metal bars appeared impassable. Mothering should not be this difficult. The urge to leave should not be this strong, but she wished to go outside where it was quiet, calm. A mother ought not to abandon her child, she knew, but she was surviving without hers, wasn't she? The sky had not yet collapsed when she had to go it alone. The world continued its spin. And that the world continued its spin is something I want to think a little bit about in a moment. But I wonder if you can, for us, think or talk with us a little bit about how you thought about these organizing themes as the book was coming together. Did you write out of a consideration of these themes, or did the themes arise themselves as the writing of individual characters came about? You know, each of them facing a particular situation, as Josephine does here. So were you writing toward the themes, or were the themes coming together as you wrote?
I like to say these characters show up. I'm sorry, I just have to say, just you reading that one scene, it wrecks me because it really was a part of being a 19-year-old mother and having zero support and just wanting for the baby to stop crying and having no way out of it. So I'm sorry to even get a little, just hearing it through someone else's voice really I'm shaken by it. But I jokingly say the characters show up in my mind and then I'm forced to pour them onto paper. Um, so I, I think when I realized that this was going to be about the mother-child relationship and how the mother and the child enter the world based on how their relationships have been, that's when it seemed like maybe this is where I needed to focus. I think then I focused um, on allowing stories in that were about the mother-child relationship and really how we enter into the world. It didn't start off that way. I really can't say that. I mean, I thought I would write about sweet dogs, and I wanted all to be, love stories and all of these amazing sweet things. And but those weren't the stories that needed to be told, I think. And I believe, I trust in myself that when a story is kind of steering me to where I need to, where I feel comfortable, that's where I go. I look for that comfort. I really do like feeling that I'm not in control of the stories. I'm here to be the fingers to pop it in. They come to mind. There's something that someone, used to say, the vision wouldn't have come to you if it wasn't meant to be, or if it wasn't going to happen, right? I'm sure I'm misquoting that. Um, and I'd like to believe that that's probably where it comes from, is subconsciously wanting to understand why it was that my mother's passed away. So I try to be cautious about what I say about the feelings that I had towards her when she was still here. But I think I began telling the stories about the relationships between mothers and daughters specifically because I really did feel unloved. And then when I would, move on to the next home or the next family and I'm living with, new strangers, and then finding myself unloved again. I just, like it's hard to not, take it, as a personal affront by the universe that I'm being put in situations where I need to, prove that I'm deserving of a kind word or kind eyes or just, gentle hands around me. And really, that's the only explanation I have for why we are, in this tiny book about the relationships between mothers and their daughters and how we present ourselves to the world based on how we've been to one another.
I don't think I've let the group know that as we get toward the, maybe 10 or 15 minutes from now, I'll be looking to the Q&A, the typed Q&A. So if you're interested in asking a question of Kesha, you can begin putting those in there. So I mentioned that phrase that ended that section that I just read, the world continued its spin.
Okay.
Right. And for Josephine, as I'm reading this, that reality that life goes on, that the world continues to spin, feels like a kind of relief to her, right? And what I read in that moment is a potential kind of inward forgiveness. I'm having these thoughts, but life goes on.
Yeah.
But what I also hear in the writing throughout every, nearly every story, is that, you have a character in the book who has a thought that the book itself sees in you as a writer, or you'll tell me that I'm wrong in this interpretation if I am, but there's a kind of indictment built into the claim that life goes on this way, that the world continues its spin, that there are these moments in the world, whether it's Josephine here or Ayamidi in the title story, No God Like the Mother, who faces extreme loss, right? Throughout this book, that's happening. And if the answer to that is the world continues to spin, or the world continues its spin, then what's going to happen? Nothing, right? So so there's this claim that this girl makes at at 17, which we feel for, but at the same time, the book itself tells us to stop and look and not let the world continue to spin. Right? Can you speak something to that, the tension that you have within the character who we feel sympathy for, but the book doesn't really allow us to feel the comfort of that she means to feel in that moment, because we have to stop and look at all these stories. Does that make sense? The question?
No, it does. I think it was the easiest way. I think it was the easiest way to insert a little bit of hope every once in a while, right? They're so heavy. Every story, I don't know that we are allowed a break. And I think if I had my say, I would rearrange the way the stories are placed in the book, because it felt like, we're hit over the head again and again and again. But my way of maybe stepping outside of these stories, even while writing them, is to just insert something that felt a little sweet after what might, feel really like what was to me when I was having that experience and not being able to console my baby as a 19-year-old, who'd been on my own for much too long, and needing to feel like, well, yes, this is hard now, but it's going to be fine later. And I that and Nobody's Child, I usually read that. I usually pick that one to read when I'm when I'm speaking, because I like having the opportunity to explain what was happening with Josephine, maybe as a way of understanding what was happening with me back then. But it really is about that, right? It's just inserting a little bit of sweet after so much darkness. I will say at the very end of Snow by Morning, where the little girl runs, finds the keys and goes out. It felt like the best way to end the book. She then, escapes and runs out into the world. That's another example of what it was, or what I had to do to insert a little bit of peace of mind for us, the reader, right? Because I don't give a lot of resolution at the end of any of these stories. There's no, I don't know that I believe in happy endings. I think, the world continues its spin is really the best happy ending that I could come up with. And it is true, right? I mean, I remember when, we discovered that my mother was passing away, and I thought, as much as I loved her and always wanted her back in my life, I always also had that fear that I would get news that she's left us, she's no longer here. And when she finally did pass away, and thankfully I was able to hold her hand when she left us, I thought, when I left that room, everything would be dark, all the trees would have fallen, no one would be there. But it feels like, the hardest parts of life come to prepare us for how it must continue. And in my, I don't know, my husband likes to say, in your version of your crazy, my version of my crazy, that's, the easiest way to do a happy ending.
I have a
Yeah.
writer. I have a writer friend who's written this, but he describes in his work the moment of the death of his mother and the birth of his son as
Mm,
being the same experience, really.
mhm,
Right? And for him, as a religious person, it's God tearing the roof off of the building and
mhm,
sort of leaving life and taking life, or in that sort of sense that in these terrifying moments, well, it's all terrifying, but
mhm.
there is that sort of resiliency, which this book has loads of. And I think that the story that you just referred to, Snow Before Morning, I'm getting the title wrong, I think. Let me
It's
look.
okay, snow by morning.
Snow by Morning, right? That that the story ends in such, I mean, begins in such hope, and then it moves through real dire hopelessness, right? And then to give us that little way out, I think is really, I don't know, structurally at least, it sort of, it feels balanced in that way, and it's great to hear you sort of talk about it in those terms too.
Yeah, and that's another story. So, we talked earlier about, which if whether we insert parts of our lives in stories, and I don't think you could be a storyteller without really taking moments from your own life, and yes, this was fictional for the most part. Um, but Snow by Morning really is the only one that's true to my experience, right? My mother did leave me with drug dealers as collateral for tickets to come back to America. And um and I don't I think I would probably rewrite that story. Well, it's in the next book, but I always was curious about who I was as that 11-year-old girl, and having that experience of having to decide, does my mother love me enough that she would come back to rescue me, or am I on my own from now on? And are these people around me that my mother's left me with, are they now my family? Do I need to navigate life with them? And it's those kinds of questions that I think come to mind, and trying to decide, what is a happy childhood, what is a happy life, what's the best experience one should have while we're here, because one day it does end, and I could fall out of my chair now and crack my skull and I'd be dead, but my dogs will still want to eat, the children will still want dinner, life does go on. So it's really about um using storytelling to sort through what all of it means. I don't know what all of it means. I know, I can make sense of one story and move on to the next, and new questions will arise, and then I sort through those, and then I move on to the next one. But the only thing I can say is I love it. I know that I love it, and I'm sure I'm not answering your question. um, but those are the thoughts that have come to my mind. And I'm seeing here, if I could say really quickly, someone's asking a question about curiosity. Uh,
Let's jump in and hear from, so
okay,
Dorian Laux,
I would love that.
yeah, Dorian Laux she's a poet in our program, a poetry faculty, and she's asking, um, thanks, Dorian, for the question. Can you, Kesha, talk about curiosity as a method or mode for writing?
Yeah, you'll find that I know that I refer to my childhood quite a bit, right? It's what I know. It's the way I experience life, and it's the way my traumas have latched onto my mind. But I think I wasn't allowed room to be curious when I was a child, right? And I grew up in Nigeria where, honestly, you walk down the road, there are 10 churches, there are 10 mosques, and they're all facing each other. But, everyone, we're all really forced to focus on, a lot of the people I knew were Christian and Muslim, and we lived quite harmoniously in the same community. But whenever I would, have questions about things that didn't quite make sense to me in the Bible, I wasn't allowed room to be curious enough for it, right? I remember asking once of a teacher, well, because in the booklets they would give us, Adam and Eve, they were white, and they were essentially the beginning of all humanity. And I asked a question about how is it that we ended up dark skinned if all humanity began with white skinned people? And I remember the teacher telling me to go kneel down and put my hands up, and instead of just saying I don't know, or these are stories that we've created for whatever, I don't know, there could have been a million other explanations, but I think I wasn't allowed the room to explore my curiosity as a child. And so I get to do it now. And I hope that I have given my children room to do so in their lives now. Because I know there's nothing like having a question that remains unanswered in your mind and feeling lost in it and not knowing really which direction to go into, because you feel, or I should say, I feel wrong for even having the thought to begin with. So curiosity, I think it leads where I go with my storytelling. It really, it helps me, it helps my courage too, if I must say, right? I'm, all the inappropriate things that come to my mind, I know I can write about it. I know I can explore it in that way. I might not be able to share it in polite company, but I know that when I sit down, I'm allowed to explore. And I think my curiosity can be blamed for a lot of the places that I allow my mind to go to now that I have this freedom of feeling like my voice does matter. And in the grand scheme of things, I don't know, one day they might decide that they need to burn No God Like the Mother, and who knows what's going to happen, sadly. But at least I have put it out there, and I've shared my thoughts on motherhood. And you can't walk people up to a scene in childbirth and not expect to have questions about why it is that I chose to, in the title story, drag us into a tent and watch this mother deliver her baby. You said earlier, Scott, about maybe themes that I might have been urged against. And, that was one of them. No one wants to hear about childbirth. No one wants to hear about sexual assaults, and certainly not FGM, and the one that really struck me was when there's a list, I have to find it in Google. But there's a list that said, these are all, topics that you shouldn't, that you should avoid in storytelling. And I just named a few of them: the childbirth, the FGM, but one was love stories between young African children or people, and that one really struck me. Why can't I tell, and of course my version of a love story begins with the violence with the two children and the silence between us. But I think it was just me finally deciding that I can rebel, because I wasn't allowed, the silence was forced on me as a girl, as the youngest girl in a family, in a big family, with a very strong, outspoken mother and sister who was equally as strong as mother. And I was this soft-spoken, sweet little angelic, perfect little girl. And now feeling like I can share my thoughts in ways that I wasn't always allowed to. Here I see.
Great. Take it away, Kesha. I'll just let you look
I
into
know,
it.
I'm sorry if I know that I will rant and ramble.
No, no, this is I'm very grateful for that answer and just the time you spent to talk about it. One of the questions that came up in the Q&A talks about self-trust, and you just spoke very clearly about self-trust and how one can develop that skill. I want to ask a question from Stephanie Wicks.
Okay.
It's in the Q&A sections. She asked, could you discuss whether you made the choice of fiction over nonfiction to tell these stories that have personal history? Did it provide more freedom or a deeper way to explore the story by writing, at least in this first book, framing everything as fiction as opposed to nonfiction?
So this was, it's easier to, I think there's more freedom in fiction, right? And I mean, I even used a quite poignant moment in my childhood, and I fictionalized it because I could go into the fantastical points in the story, in my dreams, where I'm, picturing my mother coming back and wishing for her to be there in the storytelling about the dogs and escaping and feeling like I was, that I could end up on the other side of the moon if I'd run away. If I only just ran away, maybe I could end up on the other side of the moon. I think fiction allows me the freedom to explore in ways that I don't know that nonfiction would allow. Yes, the next project that I'm working on is nonfiction, but I like the freedom that fiction allows me, or writing in fiction allows me. So I use some of those elements in telling my nonfiction story, because it is freeing to be able to, escape into the mind, go someplace else and come back and tell the story the way it needs to be told. But honestly, if I could do it again, I think fiction is probably where I would live, because there's too many fears with misquoting someone and then worrying that it'll come back down the line.
Well, fortunately, there will be more books. There will be the nonfiction book, and then you can sort of.
That's right. Fingers crossed.
So there's a Pacific faculty member watching us from the classroom on campus tonight, and that's Kathleen Posma, one of my colleagues. And she talks a lot in her class with these 8 students right now about how they pursue answers they need in order to more fully tell their stories. Do we ask an expert? Do we find an article? Do we ask a family member? Can you talk about how over time you have discovered the information you needed to write the painfully beautiful piece you read to us, or other pieces, say?
Oh, well, I was saying earlier, yes, the first time, that topic, the subject matter entered my life, I was 8 or 9 years old, and asked mom, who, her response was, well, I don't know what that is, that shouldn't leave me happening, get out of here, go play. And then never seeing this friend again, of course it sticks to my mind, whatever happened to her. And years later, as an adult, when I asked my mother, I think she said, well, that little girl probably didn't make it, because a lot of girls, when they go through that, they don't survive it, is what she said. So then when I went into the work of, into my social services work, I was an advocate for immigrants and refugees, specifically from, Kenya, Somalia, and some West Africans. When I was finding, and I'm so grateful still that a lot of these women came, seeking help with one thing, and then I think trusting me along the way to share their stories. And I've just found that topic coming up again and again and again. And that's probably when I started asking questions. I wondered if this thing is now landed in my life because I need to do something about it. I always feel like, if I, encounter a dog running down the street without a leash or a collar on, it came there because I'm there to save it, right? Or I need to do something about it. Not that I should be the savior, but what can I do to help this situation I've now find myself in? And I think it's all of it, as Kathleen says in here, asking that, yes, right, you have to do the work. Yes, we have the curiosity in our minds and we could just run with it. But I think that tends to get people in trouble when you just run with with your own belief and deciding that your way is the only way, then you miss out on the idea that, these mothers and these grandmothers, what's their reason behind putting this small child through this procedure, right? We hear one of the grandmothers say, don't scream or don't cry, your younger ones are listening, right? And even in that moment, she's and then I even say, she whose worth had to be exhibited not similarly long ago. So she's also been there and gets that this is just the way life is. So I think, and trying to I think the more avenues we use to find information, being open-minded and knowing that we are not all knowing and we don't have all the answers, really is the best way to, follow any passion that you have. Yes, do the research, ask an expert. Yes, I get to thankfully come share in conversations with other people, but I also attend other courses with other authors because I do, feel as if there's, every day is an opportunity to learn something new. Every day is a new opportunity to learn to be someone else. And who would I be? Who do I become after I've, acquired this new piece of information is really the way I like to end my days. Who are you now, Kesha, with everything you've learned today? And the question here, I was asking the family member. In writing about my family, I went to as many family members who would listen to me because I said this was a project that I promised my mother I would complete for her sake. And what I found was a lot of people were willing to give me answers, and a lot didn't want their stories shared because for the most part, people are ashamed of the way they behave. And if they're ashamed of the way they behave, they don't want it out. They would like to, see this thing die a quick death. And I just think it's a missed opportunity to grow from misbehavior. And I don't know. I've always been curious. I love that I can now be curious openly, and that's what leads me. And I hope I answered that question because I told you I ramble. I ramble on and I rant. So forgive me if I didn't quite answer it.
Kathleen's thanking you and on behalf of her class for that answer, in fact. So yeah, I think so.
Thank you, Kathleen.
And Kesha, you're talking about those opportunities you take to go and meet and think with other people and talk. And you mentioned earlier Kathy Hong Park. When I saw the picture of you together with her on social media, it was you were so happy to have met her, and that so just that. But I could tell that there even in the way you've talked about her now, there was a little bit of a I don't know exactly how to say this, but you were sort of looking to her as someone to sort of engage in that conversation with, engage in these big conversations around art, someone from whom you could learn something, right?
Yes,
That's part of it, and that's part of how I feel in talking with you tonight. So I don't want to take this too much longer than an hour. Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
From the group?
Yes,
Great.
I'm here. I'm good. Thank you. I will say, we talked, speaking with Kathy, just really quickly, sorry, everyone. We talked about, necessary betrayals, right? And if I'm speaking for that little girl I used to be, who didn't, feel safe in sharing her thoughts or expressing any curiosity she had for the world, sometimes, as I know I'm going to misquote this, but someone said, if you're worried about the way you'll be seen, you should have behaved differently. I don't know who said it, but that's what Kathy said. She's, essentially she's like, F them, just tell your story. Sometimes they're necessary betrayals, and hopefully there's then room to have a conversation once stories are out that people aren't exactly proud of. There are moments in my next project that I'm sure I'm not proud of, but I'll never run from having the conversation about how I've grown from my misbehavior and who I hope to be along the way.
So here's one final question from Mary Helen Stefaniak. I'm bowled over by the exuberance of your stories, the way the characters are so alive and indomitable, even though they are living through such impossible experiences. Are you aware of that power the characters have as you write them? Are you determined to make them endure, or do they surprise you on the page?
I think it's the surprise, but I also think that the surprise is what I look forward to. I was saying earlier that I don't do, my process and creating stories really is to, again, open a laptop, sit in there and hope for something to come, right? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I could spend an hour on one sentence or a paragraph, and sometimes I could write 4 or 5 chapters in a day. So it really is about how the words flow. I'm gonna forget the question. Scott, remind me, please.
Do you have to create the characters? Are you determined in the writing process to make the characters endure, to have that endurance and that indomitable character, or do they surprise you by becoming so?
Okay, no, I have it back. Yes. No, it's the surprise that's really most the most pleasant part of this whole experience, right? It's not knowing, like the Josephine story, the teenage mother, and that story started with, as the daughter, mother and daughter going shopping for a dress for homecoming, and and one day I was, sitting in a hospital room or writing the scene with her in the hospital room, and her life had changed. So the story about the dress for homecoming went away. I never know. And I love being surprised by where these characters demand to go. I know that that's, sometimes that feels out there, but that is the magic that happens when I'm in this room. And I've decided to just really submit to the process. Sometimes that I know, I don't know if it makes sense to anyone else, but I don't know how much control I have outside of, sentence structure and making sure that my grammar works, and making sure that I'm following all of the tools we've been given, versus, feeling like if in the world, people who look like me, whether it's female or Black or African, all of the things that I believe myself to be, whether I need to maybe represent them some way in a story, then that's where I go. I don't know how else to say that. It's the surprise that I most enjoy, when I get to the end of the story and I find all of these people have shit. It's like I open the door and all of these people came in to sit with me, and we get to have a conversation, and it's so fun. I can't, even with the dark subject matter, it really is like inviting strangers to come sit with me, and we talk about what's happened to them.
Kesha, just on that one point, I am going to, I guess, take advantage of your saying that you're here with us, because
Okay.
Because you've described this, and this will be the last one, but you've described this book as, smaller than your finger, right? But you're talking about bringing these characters together, right? There are characters that stories are set in Nigeria, one in Sudan, the one you read. There's another that's set in France. Some are set in the U.S., all over in different parts of the country, different parts mostly in the West. And there are interplay among these places, right? There's international travel here, as well as that international longing, especially in the final story. Can you talk just briefly, or not even briefly, we'll just go with this. Can you talk a little bit about the bridges that this book tries to build, and the writerly strategies and techniques you used to represent so many variations on the human experience and predicament, right? You looked at the world, you said, this is my world, I'm going to write about it.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge, right? To try to bring all those different stories together. So what do you, or maybe it's not difficult, it just feels difficult to me. Go for it. And I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Scott. No, these are great questions. I love when a moderator comes ready with the questions, because then it moves so smoothly. So I appreciate that. I should say that first of all. I think it was probably me, the questions I had about the world, and me wanting a more empathetic experience. you know, the book came out in 2019 at a time when I really was feeling like we as a country, we were moving towards a less empathetic view of people who didn't look like us, of people who were, you know, coming to to our country and seeking, you know, lives that I know, and I know what it was like to be on the other side, and you know, that international longing that you just mentioned. I know what it's like to be on the other side, and knowing that, you know, hoping that my life would be so much different if I was just somewhere else, if I were just someplace else that felt safer, right? If my mother would only just come back for me, then XYZ would be solved. I think it was me hoping that we would get there. And when I started noticing, I think when I noticed that there was this running theme of hoping for empathy for the characters, I thought, all right, well, let's focus on what this means. And you know, I know that I write the, you know, the first story is about a woman in a village in Nigeria who's now given birth, and then, you know, and you know, siblings that have to help raise children. That's not an experience that everyone has, and you know, who lives here for the most part. But we all might know a thing or two about what it is to take care of our younger ones when our parents cannot. And I think that's the bridge there, is knowing that you don't have to be from, you know, West Africa to understand what it's like to step in when a parent is unavailable. You don't have to be from Sudan to know that it's an awful experience to lay down and be forced to go through a procedure that really could kill you. And that only happens when we decide that we're going to see each other as human. It's the humanity behind it that I was hoping would come to the forefront. And it feels as if that might have happened somehow, because you know that the feeling you're getting when you read, or when someone said they when I read The Bride Price just then, right? You can empathize with a person like that, and then the idea at the end when I said, well, it's the price one pays to be wife and mother. You know, you don't need to be from Sudan to understand exactly, you know, how hefty that line might feel for someone who doesn't want their story to head that way, right? Marriage, you know, being able to control who you marry, or when you marry, or whether you want children or don't want children, how many you want. It really was maybe just me wanting to feel like there's more control in the world than women and girls are allowed to have, and crossing my fingers and hoping a few little words will help change that.
That's where we should end.
Yeah.
Kesha, this was wonderful. I'm so glad for this time we were able to spend together. For all of the people who were here witnessing this experience, witnessing your reading and your thoughts about your work, thank you so much for being here with us. It's so meaningful. And I wish everyone a wonderful night, great rest of the week. And Kesha, congratulations on all that's coming your way. It's so wonderful. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I'm sure I'll see some of you out in the world. Thank you all so much for coming in and sharing your evening. I really appreciate it more than the little bit of time we had. Maybe next time we'll be able to do it in person.
Let's count on it.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm sorry to everyone that I didn't get to answer your questions. Please find me on Instagram or everywhere else and ask them, and I promise to answer. All right.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Good night, everyone. All right. Thank you so much, Scott.
Bye, Kesha.